Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversities, or AVA's, Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yersich. With AVA, I'm an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series, along with my amazing colleagues Jason and Andrea, who are here with us today. Outside of my role, at AVA, I'm the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children and faculty in Sociology and Criminology at Capilano University. I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Coquitlam First Nation. And on behalf of AVA, because we are a nationwide organization, I want to begin by acknowledging that, on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I'll share just a couple of quick procedural things. You may have noticed this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to AVA's YouTube channel shortly after. This means you can revisit and share the webinar at any time, along with all of our previous webinars. Once I'm done with the introduction, I will put a link in the chat where you can access both past and upcoming webinars. You may notice that the chat has been disabled. We can use it to communicate with you, but if you would like to communicate with us during the presentation, for example, if you have tech issues, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature. I also encourage you to use the Q&A feature throughout the presentation to pose questions to our speaker, Olivia, who will make time to have a conversation with me at the end to address any questions that you may have. You'll also notice that in the chat, toward the end of the webinar, my colleague Jason will post a link to a survey, and we hope that you'll take it to let us know how you like this webinar and also what you'd like to see for upcoming webinars. Without further ado, the focus of today's webinar is Rethinking Help Seeking and Community Responsibility, Canadian Women's Experiences of Intimate Partner Stalking. We are joined by my colleague and friend, Olivia Peters, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Guelph and researching intimate partner stalking, risk, and help seeking. Olivia also holds an AVA internship with the Sagesse Domestic Violence Prevention Society. She is passionate about interdisciplinary, community-based research and victim survivor advocacy. Her experience spans anti-violence research at local, national, and international levels. Olivia, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. All right, I'm going to move along to the next slide and we can get started. Let's see, hopefully my controls are working. All right, do I have a thumbs up from Sarah? Sorry, you disappeared for a second there.
Yeah, we can see it. All good.
Well, wonderful. Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I cannot see you currently through my screen, but I know that you're all there, and I've just received some really lovely messages in my email about this presentation, and I'm so excited that so many of you are interested and curious about this topic. So as Sarah said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph in sociology. I also work as a criminologist and sociologist in my work outside of academia. And so this presentation is a brief overview of a portion of my dissertation. So I wanted to be able to go a little bit more in depth just with this section and give you an overview of what we've been looking at as far as Canadian women's experiences of intimate partner stalking, their thoughts on risk and responsibility and help seeking. So this is just a brief overview of what we'll be going through. I'd like to start off, as always, with a land acknowledgement, provide some context for what we'll be talking about today, some survivor experiences and implications based on those experiences, and then talk about technology and future directions for research on IPS and IPS response, as well as some final concluding thoughts and, of course, a Q&A. So in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I'd like to first acknowledge my connection to this land. I was proudly born on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabeg, Dakota Oyate, Denisovan, and Nihilwak nations, homeland of the Red River Métis, also known as Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm also grateful to be speaking to you all today from Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and Stoney Nakoda peoples, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta. So we'll just get into some definitions to start. So stalking, as I use it in my work, is repetitive and unwanted contact from a current or former intimate partner. Victims do not need to fear for their safety or the safety of others for a behavior or act to be considered intimate partner stalking. Stalking can take place in person and or virtually, whereby the victim is monitored and or intimidated by the offender or offenders. Some distinguish between stalking and harassment, while others do not. So sometimes harassment is used interchangeably. This is often conflated with one another because our criminal code uses the term criminal harassment as an umbrella term to refer to stalking. So sometimes you'll hear that language as well. Now, technology-facilitated violence is an umbrella term used to describe the use of digital technologies to perpetrate interpersonal harassment, abuse, and violence, such as sexual abuse, domestic and family violence, prejudice-based hatred, and online othering. So some of the research focuses specifically on technology-facilitated violence, which is why I've included it here. Just a quick note before we move forward, I will be using the term victim and survivor somewhat interchangeably throughout this presentation. It's not because these are equated with one another or the same, but that at times they reflect what language was used by the women that participated in this research, and that at some points they determined that they were victims and then were survivors at some points. There's a temporal element to it, but just a note, I will be using both terms. So when did we start to care about stalking? It was actually quite recent. It wasn't until the early 1990s that stalking was of interest to academia and academics. In 1989, the death of actress Rebecca Schaeffer facilitated the inclusion of stalking in criminal law. However, her death furthered the belief that stalking crimes only really affected celebrities. So it was considered a sensational type of violence, with perpetrators depicted as mentally unstable with an unhealthy obsession with a celebrity or public figure. In 1990, as I mentioned, it was included in criminal law. California became the first state to pass an anti-stalking law. In addition to Schaeffer, 4 women had been killed in Orange County the previous year, despite having restraining orders in place. So again, it wasn't really until something happened to someone relatively high profile that change started. In 1999, stalking was researched as a known risk factor for homicide, so that connection was made quite quickly. Shortly thereafter, it was determined that people in intimate partner relationships are at a higher risk compared to strangers or acquaintances. So again, a lot of research was happening in the early 2000s. This was between 2001, 2003. And then in 2008, the first stalking-specific risk assessment, known as the SAM, was developed by Randall Kropp and colleagues. So again, quite recent. In Canada, criminal harassment is a crime largely affecting women, as women account for 76% of all stalking victims. These findings are supported internationally, with research finding that men are more likely to be perpetrators and women more likely victims. So with women facing an increased risk of intimate partner stalking, it's unsurprising that the rates of cyber stalking victimization in Canada are also higher for women than for men. Victimization in online space has profound impact on the nature and prevalence of intimate partner stalking. In other words, methods of intimate partner stalking are constantly evolving. It's no longer understood as only occurring in the physical world, but includes online monitoring, hacking, and distance surveillance, resulting in the proliferation of domestic and sexual violence in virtual settings. And this is something that we are starting to have been contending with, but are starting to contend with in different ways more recently with the advent of artificial intelligence. Something we'll be talking about a little bit later. So why focus on intimate relationships? As I mentioned before, there is a higher risk of homicide and femicide in intimate relationships compared to stranger or acquaintance relationships. So while this presentation does not focus on offenders per se or explaining why people stalk, the nature of the intimate relationship presents a complex factor for stalking, or a set of complicating factors for the victim. So the stalker, a current or former partner, more often knows more intimate information about the victim that can be used to further facilitate stalking behavior. So this can include things like prior access to accounts, online accounts, financial accounts, more ways to harass or abuse the partner, a potential history of abuse in the relationship. So we see all sorts of creative ways, methods that intimate partners have used to abuse, and this also happens in stalking as well. Now, there are varied types of risk assessments that are used primarily by police, victim services, and social service response organizations and psychologists. These are used to measure the risk presented by a perpetrator and or faced by a victim of stalking. And they use a professional judgment, actuarial methods, or a combination of both. If you think about it, professional judgment is what it sounds like. It's somebody applying their own professional history and training and skill to a situation to understand the context of the situation and make some sort of judgment or statement about what's happening. And actuarial methods involve usually some sort of checklist or scale or scales that are used to give a score. And based on that score, you would have some sort of outcome for what would be able to happen. There is a lot of interesting literature on what is best, particularly in stalking. So is it best that we use professional judgment or actuarial methods or some combination? How did we arrive at the SAM or other assessments that have happened since? It's a very interesting discussion to get into. In some cases, formal services are unable to act until a victim's circumstances meet specific criteria. And this is where we're seeing some issues in risk assessment, particularly when a risk assessment is done, potentially deemed low risk in a case, and something higher risk occurs afterwards because they didn't receive the necessary services or supports that they were looking for. So again, these are some pretty significant issues. So you might be wondering, why, Olivia, are there jelly beans on the screen? There's one example that came to mind and comes to mind when I think about risk assessment. And in this particular case, a woman went to police because every day or every other day, her ex-husband was leaving a jelly bean on the hood of her car. Her car was parked in front of her house. And it had a certain meaning for her. It indicated that he was watching her, he was monitoring her, and the jelly bean had some sort of significance in their immediate relationship, which wouldn't have been apparent outside of the relationship, of course. She went to police to report it, and as you might imagine, police responded with, someone's leaving candy on your car. We can't really do anything about that. No one's breaking any laws, and it's just a jelly bean. I won't get into details, but things escalated from there. So something as seemingly benign as a jelly bean highlights the importance of victim or survivor perceptions of risk. And this is what we're getting into, is that victim and survivor perspective matters, context matters. And that's where this research comes in. So this is, again, just a portion of my dissertation. I did in-depth interviews with Canadian women who identified as survivors of intimate partner stalking. We ended up with a sample of 20 women. It was quite difficult to get to this number. because I didn't recruit through a specific social service or social services generally. I wanted to ensure that I talked to women who may not be receiving services or they didn't seek help. So again, it's difficult just to find people that want to talk to essentially a stranger about some of the most difficult moments in their life. So we ended up with a sample of 20. 19 out of 20 of these women were stalked by men, and 14 out of these 20 women identified as heterosexual. If you want more information about the sample, I'm more than happy to discuss that later. They were asked about risk, help seeking, and recommendations for improved response to intimate partner stalking. And this study used a narrative story-based approach to elicit data that can complement and contextualize existing quantitative studies, because a lot of the research out there at this point is quantitative. This used an interpretive phenomenological approach, as well as teller-focused interviewing, which is a feminist and narrative-based approach, which places focus on validating women's experiences. Due to the sensitive nature of the interview content, narrative story-based interviewing was used to facilitate sharing personal and sensitive experiences while framing the participant as the subject expert. Sometimes when I do interviews, I've done many outside of this research with survivors of different forms of intimate partner violence and crime. And often I get the question, well, what is it you're looking for? Or is that the right answer? And I always respond with something to the effect of, you are the expert on your experience. I'm not looking for any one particular answer. So that's why this approach was used. Then I coded for thematic and discursive content using in vivo 14 software. So let's get into survivor-defined stalking and risk. Despite available national statistics on criminal harassment, the extent to which stalking occurs is largely unknown. It's likely, as with most crime statistics, it's likely that it's not actually showing the full picture. This is happening a lot more often, so the rates are certainly conservative. Many victims of stalking do not report victimization or are not certain if stalking has occurred when it may very well have. As well, stalking occurs concurrently with other forms of victimization. And so it's difficult to know the extent, because sometimes it might be primarily coded as a different form of violence, and stalking might not be included or seen as important in the statistics. So again, these factors further complicate these approaches to studying intimate partner stalking and knowing exactly what's out there. Also, two individuals that experience the same form of stalking behavior may have completely different or they may have complete disagreement as to whether an act constitutes stalking whatsoever. And so that's why I wanted to look at how victims or survivors are perceiving stalking and perceiving risk in their lives. So the following slides show consensus on what is stalking, what is risk, knowing that there is some variation. So generally, participant responses aligned with mainstream definitions of criminal harassment in our criminal code, particularly in the inclusion of the terms repeated and unwanted. I think this came across in every single interview, repeated and unwanted. Survivors specified that stalking included monitoring and controlling victims' behavior across physical and virtual spaces, and overt and or covert threatening behaviors. So I included a quote here from participant 5. It wasn't what he was doing. It wasn't that it was hitting. He could have sent a bouquet of flowers to my door every day. It was the repeated unwanted reminder that he was doing stuff that I asked him not to. It's a form of terrorism where terror is set up as an underlying promise. So this relates back to that jelly bean example, right? It doesn't matter exactly what the act is, but the intent is to cause harm in some way. Further, participants talked about how stalking was normalized and minimized. Some had a preference for the term criminal harassment rather than stalking in the interviews for this reason, because they felt that stalking was, as participant 6 says, was bandied about by the public in ways that are really minimizing. Another quote from participant 9, people will say, oh, I, stalked them online. And what they mean to say is they just looked through somebody's profile to find like a really cute outfit. Again, this is being normalized and minimized to the point where if you tell somebody, hey, I think I'm being stalked, or this person's stalking me, that they don't take it seriously or might think it's not a big deal. And they also talked about how stalking is harmful, again, even if it isn't physically violent or isn't in person, because we often think about in-person stalking as being more harmful. Now, when asked about risk, how do you conceptualize risk? Risk was seen as inherently negative when associated with help seeking. So it was not about the chance of things getting better or improving in any way, but focused on making sure that things just don't worsen. So the implications are that women would rather seek out informal sources of support or none at all, simply to maintain how things were rather than risk things getting worse. So if you really think about, like, that's big. They would rather continue to be stalked and continue to deal with things as they were rather than risk things getting worse, right? It was also discussed as a statistical calculation associated with what you're willing to lose. Risk was seen as omnipresent. It is everywhere. It is everywhere in our lives. It is around every corner. I will note that these interviews started in the fall of 2023 into 2024. So this was just coming out of the pandemic and shutdowns and things like that. And so it was also discussed in relation to COVID. I think only one participant referenced COVID explicitly. Risk was about the inability to live life normally. So that the importance wasn't placed necessarily on living in fear, but that it was about not being able to go about your business, to take the same route to work, to drive in the same spots or park in the same spots you normally would, things like that. Risk is not limited, again, to physical violence, and risk was about escalation. Only one participant out of the 20 talked about the at risk as a chance of things improving, because risk doesn't have to be inherently negative. The boiling water on the stove was one example that a participant included. She said, it's like the lobster in a slowly warming up and boiling pot of water. I didn't really know what was happening until it was too late. And that to her really encapsulated her experiences and how she felt about risk. Now, getting into victimization, victimization was characterized by well, man, there were a range of abusive tactics, and like I say here, characterized by coercive control. I'm going to include a list here, but it is in no way getting at everything that occurred. But this is just kind of a brief list. So online included monitoring, sextortion, often with sex tapes or intimate images. Again, going back to what I was talking about the specific, why is an intimate partner relationship different? Often they would have access to this kind of content. Threats, institutional harassment as well. So in one example, somebody had emailed the victim's school and made some bogus claims, and the school ended up having to investigate her, and she almost got expelled. So there were things that would happen using institutions to try to harass. Offline was tech-based monitoring. This is technology that did not include any sort of internet access. So it could be offline GPS, use of Apple AirTags, things like that. Monitoring and contact via a third party. Somebody from prison was able to use their prison buddies who had recently gotten out to continue to monitor and threaten her. Threats, again, this was threats to harm themselves, the victim, or others, such as pets and children. Social isolation, financial dependence, physical and sexual violence, as well as abuse during pregnancy. Now, stalking ability varied, but was generally made possible through things like social media, like websites and applications. Technologies, like I said, GPS, Apple AirTags, closed circuit television, and email. Email was actually used quite often because it's really difficult to stop somebody from contacting you through email without just getting a new email address. And sometimes, especially if you have a work email, it's quite difficult to do. Family, friends, and institutions, so work, school, law enforcement, and professional organizations. As far as formal help seeking, generally speaking, women sought help from police, lawyers, psychologists, human resources, or coworkers, and physicians, though many did not connect physical health and well-being to stalking in terms of help seeking. So if they would go to a physician, it would be for the impact of stalking rather than going and saying, I'm being stalked and I need help. It was, I have higher blood pressure, or I have these rashes that won't go away from all the stress, or mental health condition or something like that. So it's something interesting that could be looked into further. Women didn't really know what to expect from police. It was really difficult to understand when they called what was going to happen or what police could do. They were also largely unaware of existing social services and victim rights. So for example, the right to domestic violence leave in Canada, I think it's 5 days of domestic violence leave. And a lot of these women were, I would say, about middle to upper class, and felt that they needed to be in poverty, or were taking services away from people that really did need it, if they were to access social services. So even if social services didn't explicitly say it's for people of lower socioeconomic status, they were already excluding themselves from seeking help because it wasn't clear to them if these services really were for them. Women experienced re-victimization in formal help seeking, and this was through inconsistent responses and a lack of follow through. This was largely in relation to their experiences with police. They generally had better experiences with female supports or female officers, but many cases involved discovering that law enforcement did not follow through on opening up a case file. They had called multiple times, they had collected all this information and provided it to police, but a file ultimately wasn't created at all. So there was no record. Self-advocacy was seen as a full-time job, and this was felt among many participants, and resulted in a reliance on informal supports as resources through things like documentation, system navigation, psychological and physical support, and safety planning, because they weren't able to get help with any of these things through any other means. Women also described threshold issues. So often police were unable to take action because they didn't meet a certain threshold or criteria for being able to receive help or be, what's the word? To have their case moved on to connected with victim services, essentially. So it required that victims found more creative methods of safety planning, and would do so primarily through informal supports. Women explained that they often had to feign fear to be taken seriously. If they went and they said, I'm not able to live my life normally, I want this to stop, I'm being victimized repeatedly, but didn't show that they weren't shaking, they weren't crying, they weren't fearing for their life, they were fearing for their future and their quality of life. They were not met with those resources, or a file wasn't created. So yes, this includes being able to access victim services. Very few actually were put in touch with victim services. It was also unclear if any risk assessment tools were used at all. One quote here says, "Everything you read is like, the only way that you get a response and reduce your risk is if they do something violent to you. I felt like I was at risk all the time of him finally deciding to attack. And I also feel like he knew that. He knew exactly how far you can park and how much you can take before you're at risk of breaking the law. In this case, he would park just far enough from her workplace that he was still able to monitor her. But police would show up and say, well, he's not doing anything illegal. We can't really do anything about it. Um, Responsibilization was another main theme that came through with formal help seeking. Victims were held responsible to deal with victimization and help themselves. So responsibilization was this view that victims facilitate their own victimization. Victim methods of risk mitigation were often met with judgment. One of the primary examples of risk mitigation was actually continued contact with the ex-partner. So they found that if they stopped responding to his emails or messages, that things would escalate, the threats would escalate. But that if they continued to respond with benign, oh, yeah, I see your message and whatever, that they knew where he was at mentally and could keep him from doing anything or threatening in a way that was going to be increasingly problematic. However, when they would go to police or social services, they would say, well, did you stop contacting him? Well, if you haven't stopped contacting him, you're not taking this seriously. And again, we're held responsible for victimization that way. In this quote, participant 3 said, victims are told to delete your social media, change your name so this person can't find you, change all your passwords, do all this stuff. There are really good reasons why people don't want to do that. At some point, it's like, I'm losing so much of my life to this person. I can't go where I want to go. I don't feel comfortable in my skin. I don't feel safe in my car. I feel like I'm being watched. I can't use social media to interact. This participant went on to talk about the importance of social media as far as connecting with informal support, so your friends, your family, your coworkers, and being able to, again, live life normally, especially as someone who's relatively, in her case, relatively young. So social media, especially access to apps like Instagram or TikTok, were very important to her, and she felt were very important to other people as well. Some participants actually completely turned off all of their social media for a few years. So you can imagine the impact that would have on ability to connect and feel relatively normal. Looking at informal help seeking, most experiences of informal help seeking were positive and even deemed a matter of luck. They were just lucky that they had really good friends around them or that things turned out okay. The majority were provided with support through validation of experiences. And this is seemingly simple, but was integral to both mental and physical health, simply being believed. And you can imagine after going through formal help seeking experiences, being believed and having somebody say, I see you, I hear you. Maybe I don't understand, but I'm there with you, was very, very important for health. And the flip side of that is if someone didn't have that, they don't have that, they feel very alone and isolated. So this had the ability to mitigate that normalization and minimization of stalking. They also noted that there were some backdoor methods of accessing formal supports this way. Some of them had friends who had skills that were helpful to them. So one woman said, oh, my friend said I know a female police officer who can help you. And that female police officer was able to go in and say, hey, they haven't actually created a file for you. So I'm going to follow up and make sure this happens. But that wouldn't have happened had she not had that connection through a friend, right? Informal community supports were able to lighten burdens and address barriers to safety. And like I said before, this included things like documentation, system navigation, because it's hard to know where to go for help, emotional and physical supports, and safety. One example here was, I was lucky my friend was in school to be a psychologist. She knew what to do and told me to go to the police because with the evidence, I could get a restraining order. And this particular participant didn't know that they had enough for a restraining order or what the process was. Now, not every experience of informal help seeking was helpful, unfortunately, and a lot of people experienced shame. Um, Women identified shame, it's important to note, they identified shame before and subsequent to seeking help. So shame could exist before and be a barrier to seeking any sort of help, certainly, but it also could happen as a result of seeking help. So in this example, I'm probably one of the 4 or 5 people that were in a relationship with somebody outside of your community. It's a big thing. And they were just like, that's what happens when you disrespect your nationality, when you date a white guy. I didn't know what to do. I blamed myself as a woman. Like, why can't you be better so that he's better? So there's a lot going on in this particular example, but this participant discussed feeling shame and guilt and being responsible for what had happened to her. She was made to feel badly for attracting a stalker, seen as encouraging that behavior, and like she should have known better and should have been able to deal with things on her own. And this was also tied to those intersecting identities. As I've alluded to before, public discourse was very impactful throughout informal community support seeking. So informal supports would be influenced by public discourse. Stalking and its impacts were minimized, showing a general lack of understanding. And every participant discussed the lasting impacts of intimate partner stalking victimization. In this one example, she says, people ask me all the time, are you over it? Even my current boyfriend doesn't get it. He's like, just don't think about it anymore. Don't worry about it. So women identified how some people just didn't understand, even though they now knew someone who had personally been affected. So that goes back to that omnipresence of risk, of the impacts of stalking, this heightened awareness of your behavior patterns, the inability to maybe be in the moment, even after things have subsided. Now, in terms of policy and action, historically, we only see change after a catalyzing event. And by that, I mean, it's usually a death or a near death. For cyberbullying, we have a couple of really great examples. So Rehtaeh Parsons and the Cyber Safety Bill, and Amanda Todd and Bill C-26. So at times, following something that is absolutely traumatic and devastating, we do see change. This isn't always the case, but these are 2 really phenomenal examples. The internet is largely seen as the Wild West. Anything can and will happen. And so there really isn't enough to protect people from victimization on the internet. And we do see connections in literature between cyberbullying and stalking. That's why these things are connected here, or are included here. But we need an ability to better understand what happens on the internet and what we can do about it. Certainly, current stalking laws are not enough to protect victims from homicide and suicide. And one example of this is Camille Runke in Winnipeg, who was stalked by her ex-partner and then killed. She had a protection order. She had gone to police. She had installed CCTV. She was of a socioeconomic status that she could engage in certain safety and protective behaviors that other women might not have been able to on their own. So she had done basically everything you could do. She let her neighbors know, printed off photos of him and handed them to her neighbors and said, if you see this person, please call the police, let me know. But even after all of that was killed. Sorry about that. So in this case, there was really nothing that did happen as a result afterwards. There were news stories certainly that discussed this and discussed how this could have been better handled, but we didn't see the same kinds of change. So it doesn't always happen after an event like that, unfortunately. And that's where this research comes in. There are informal methods of resistance. I've included some examples here. So the first is the Facebook page. It's hotly debated and contested, but there are Facebook pages for different areas around the world called "Are We Dating the Same Guy?" So people will post their experiences of having been stalked, harassed, abused um, on this page, or they find out that someone is married and share it on there. So there are positives that can come out of it, such as people with a history of sexual offending that are registered sex offenders that are on an application like Bumble or something like that, that someone will share and say, look out for this person. But again, this is also hotly debated as far as the ethics of sharing this kind of personal information from somebody and potentially bogus claims, trying to defame people that maybe aren't sex offenders or where nothing is necessarily wrong. So we do see that as a method of resistance. A more formal version is Spark in the US. So it's a centralized organization that provides up-to-date information on stalking. And so the ability to have all your information in one place is incredibly important for women's safety, for people's safety generally. And lastly, another method of resistance is sharing survivor stories, noting that publicizing a story is not the same as normalizing to the point where people just don't care. It's about putting a face and a name to something that does happen in our society. One great example being Julie Lalonde, who I'll talk about in a little bit. So as far as technology, new technology is created all of the time. If we think about it, I mean, how many of you have reported a post or a message to an app or website that you saw, like Instagram, on Reddit, Instagram, or Snapchat, Facebook? So when you see something harmful on the internet, whose responsibility is it to deal with it? When you click that little report button, where does it go? And does anything actually happen to it? Oftentimes, nothing happens. It's not deemed to fit whatever their qualifications are for something that's taken down. It's very easy for people to post whatever they want on the internet. And again, that's why we kind of refer to it as the Wild West. When we think about new technology, we think about it as a means of safety, but also as a means of risk. Some examples here. So how easy is it to find your friend's location? We recently had an example on Instagram where people's locations were being shared without their explicit consent. So there are things like that we have to consider. It can be used as a safety method. So say you're in an Uber, you can share your location with your friends. They know exactly where you are in case something does go wrong. But it also can present a risk. Someone knows exactly where you are in real time. They know if you're home or not. They know who you're with. And these are the kinds of things that are used to stalk. Also, the example of Apple AirTag use and misuse. This is also used in human trafficking, dropping an AirTag into somebody's pocket or their bag and knowing exactly where they are. Some other things to consider, normalizing language. So again, participants talked about this in relation to informal supports. So we talk about following someone on social media. I don't know how many of us have thought, hey, that sounds a bit odd, but it is a normalized way of talking about something that in terms of stalking is inherently negative. So following someone on social media, I stalked him online, or I stalked her, again, that example of finding a really cute outfit or finding out what restaurant they went to or something like that. So it normalizes this kind of language such that when people go to seek help, it impacts their ability to receive any type of support or understanding. And then also some considerations as far as normalizing behavior. So constant monitoring and access. We're on our phones or using technology, most of us quite frequently. We're used to being able to monitor things, have access to our accounts, and be online and share what we're doing. Um, one example of this is teaching kids, teaching young people, well, teaching everyone not to share exactly where they are at that point in time. If you want to share something, wait a little bit and then share it later, or share it the next day, so that people don't know that you're on vacation, or don't know that you are at that specific location, that you're not at home or whatever. Some other normalizing behaviors, seeing jealousy as romantic or caring. We see this generally in domestic violence literature. And then also saying, it's not that bad, particularly when it isn't a form of physical abuse. Oh, it's not that bad, or, it could be worse, or it's not as bad as. Like, these kinds of things do start to normalize, that we don't take it as seriously. So this is Julie Lalonde, an example I want to bring up because her book truly is a really wonderful example of a different form of normalization. So we don't want to normalize stalking in the sense of minimizing it, but being able to put faces and names and stories to intimate partner stalking is an incredible thing to be able to do, because so few people are able to do that, are willing to do that. And in Julie's case, she was able to do this after her ex-partner rather, passed away in an unrelated car accident. So it allowed her to be able to share her story. So Julie was repeatedly stalked, harassed, and sexually assaulted by her ex-boyfriend during and after their relationship. And so she shares about this in her book, Resilience is Futile: The Life and Death and Life of Julie S. Lalonde. Just one of the many books that I highly recommend. I'm happy to talk about that later. So we know that IPS happens, but we don't always know the extent of it. And these kinds of examples let us know a little bit more about the extent of it. In this example as well, she talks about formal help seeking and informal help seeking and issues with threshold. So stories like hers are really crucial for us to learn about the realities of stalking victimization. And it's beneficial for both victims and survivors, and non-victim survivors. So people that don't have lived experience, but could benefit from learning about this. So some key findings from this research. Ultimately, participants showed that stalking risk mitigation is a community endeavor, requiring that informal and formal supports believe disclosures and better understand the nature of intimate partner stalking. I've summarized some of the key findings here. So one, about being aware and critical of how stalking and risk are conceptualized and used in everyday language. So for example, how does it show up in social media, conversations with colleagues and friends, etc.? And what implications does this have for stalking normalization? What implications as well might this have for things like public education and programming for victims or survivors? Second, we should critique this fear standard or understanding of what the impacts of stalking look like, and consider how it might explicitly or implicitly operate in your own work, life, or studies. How do we expect people to normally behave? And is this actually counter to what people are experiencing? Third, where applicable, formal responders or organizations should focus on the intent of the action over emotional and physical impact. It's not to mean that we shouldn't focus on emotional or physical impact at all, but that the intent and the context of a relationship matter a lot, and we don't give enough attention to them. So don't be so focused on, well, do the impacts fit these certain criteria? But instead look at what's the context of their relationship? What did this mean for this victim or this survivor of intimate partner stalking? And then what are those impacts? So relatedly, where applicable, non-physical impacts should be taken seriously as well. Oftentimes we think about, we wait for things to escalate and we think about risk in terms of the physical implications. And this is really problematic because it's those non-physical implications that are precursors to things like that ultimately could end up in homicide. So we need to consider that as well. Fifth, risk mitigation is a community endeavor. It requires better understanding of stalking and what we can do to prevent and address it. One quick example, because I know I'm just over time, is a landlord who was told about the stalking. A woman said that she knew that she was being watched by her ex-partner outside of her bedroom window, but that every time she would call police or she would go there were no traces of him being there. The landlord decided that they would do some landscaping and change out the rocks. There was like a rock garden. So they would change out the rock garden that was beneath that window. She was on the first floor with a flower bed and put soil down. And sure enough, the next time that she had been stalked, they were able to get a footprint to prove that he had actually been there. So again, if her landlord hadn't taken her seriously, we don't necessarily know what would have happened, but certainly it had a good outcome for her. And lastly, there is a need for victim reassurance and belief, advocacy, safety planning. This support that we see through informal supports primarily, but should happen from any type of support. So then we have just some final thoughts. So we need to question the current systems we have in place against what victims need. So some examples are criminal harassment law, peace bonds and restraining orders and fear. Usually you have to fear for your life in order to receive these things. Police assessment and documentation practices and having to meet certain criteria or certain standards in order for this to be the case. And public views or beliefs about healthy relationships and stalking. Is it stalking without fear? Yes. It should be about the inability to live life normally. And as part of this, being able to have centralized resources and information similar to Spark in the US. We need to think about the future of intimate partner stalking and the need for better protection, particularly in online infrastructure. So something I was kind of trying to talk about when my kitten rudely interrupted us. So thank you for your patience on that. But online infrastructure really isn't built for us to be able to protect ourselves and others. We think about this primarily in terms of cyberbullying and children, but more broadly for stalking, this is the case as well. So how are we normalizing online stalking? And why are we waiting for a catalyzing event to occur? This is something that we can start to think about and innovate now. And lastly, we need to shift the narrative from a private issue to community responsibility. This is something historically we've thought about as far as intimate partner violence, thinking about things from a private issue to a public trouble is how it was discussed in the literature. Let's take that further and talk about community responsibility. What does that mean as far as our discourse? What does that mean as far as supporting one another? And we should think about how the future of public discourse, about the future of public discourse and how it operates in our personal lives and our professional lives as well. So with that, I want to thank you for listening and thank you for having me here. This research is funded by the Council of Ontario Universities, SSHRC, and supported by the University of Guelph. And I want to thank Ava for having me.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for the fabulous presentation. It's always so wonderful to hear you speak and to learn from your work. I will just
Thank you.
give a quick reminder to the folks here. Please use the Q&A to put some questions up for Olivia, and she and I will have a good dialogue about them. We do have one question already, but before we dive in, I just wanted to know, it's one of the more generic questions, but also an easier one. For you, as you do your research, what were either the biggest takeaways or the most surprising takeaways or both that you found through your data collection and analysis?
Sorry, you said the most surprising.
Or the biggest or both.
Okay. Sorry, it cut out for a split second. You said takeaways from.
Oh yeah, from your research. So like
Oh,
big
sure.
takeaways, surprising takeaways, like what really stood out to you?
Um, there were many, and I think um, sometimes one of them certainly wasn't around fear, but was around women's feeling like you know the real issue here is I can't live life normally. And that there's one wonderful quote. I wish I had time to include it as well. But it was that she felt like all of the power is in the individual doing the stalking. It is imposed on the victim, and the victim is left to deal with absolutely everything that falls out. So this aligns with that idea of it feeling like a full-time job. Certainly documentation felt like a full-time job for a lot of people, but feeling like uh, this one person said basically, I served my time this whole or his time this whole time. I served a sentence for something that I did not deserve. And so I think it's really just the impact on ability to live life normally, in the sense that that is simply all women wanted. It wasn't necessarily, I'm afraid he's going to kill me. It was, how is it that this person is able to control everything unchecked for so long, and questioning practices in relation to that. So we really shouldn't be allowed. It shouldn't be this easy, I think, was the kind of the thought that came out of that. But I think it was um, surprising to an extent that that took such a central role over fear.
What a powerful quote from one of your participants and also finding. We do have a question then from Patrick, who says, "Hi, Olivia. Great to see you, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. The risk literature has shown for decades that negative emotions cause people to increase their risk estimate, while positive or neutral emotional reactions lead to a decrease in risk estimate.
Mhm.
Is it possible that many officers simply don't feel the pain, fear, or panic of victims?"
Hello, Patrick. It's lovely to see you. We haven't talked in a while. If anyone wants to check out Dr. Parnaby's work, he's fantastic, and a lovely risk scholar. Yeah, so I think the literature talked about officers needing more training in intimate partner stalking. Often they only got, I think, a few hours, and that would be special. That would be considered specialized training. Otherwise, stalking was part of training within intimate partner violence, which again already is critiqued for having such a small amount of time dedicated to it, 3 hours to a half day or something like that, depending on where you are, what jurisdiction. So it gets into an interesting discussion around to what extent do we believe victims as far as their risk estimates. Do we believe them? I'm of the mind we should, and that in this case with officers, um, officers don't necessarily they think in terms of criminal code. That's their job. So when they're looking at a case, they're looking at, can I lay a charge? If not, really, what am I doing here? And I think this comes down to better understanding what are the ways that police can support um, without needing to think in terms of that black and white. So regardless of whether or not you're able to lay a charge, can you do something to help mitigate the risk that's faced or experienced here? I'm not sure if I'm answering your question completely because the question disappeared. Oh, here it is. So yeah, I mean, officers wouldn't necessarily feel, do they have the time and capacity to feel the pain and fear of the people that they're working with? Not necessarily. It's probably a protective factor as well. Um, it's really that police are in their role, they have a unique opportunity to support. And in doing so, should be taking it seriously regardless of how people are presenting. There's one really interesting paper on how Black women specifically were less likely to exhibit fear in intimate partner stalking or stalking generally. And so that led to fewer resources for Black women compared, and in this case, it was an American study that compared Black women and white women. So, this also has implications beyond just thinking in terms of gender, but thinking in terms of intersecting identities as well, and inequity of support. I'm not sure if that answers your question. I really hope it does.
I thought it was a
But thank
very
you.
fulsome answer. And if
Thanks.
Patrick has follow-up questions, he's welcome to use the Q&A.
I'm
I
sure
do
he'll email
want
me.
to. So a colleague, I see. So I'll leave the Q&A open for just another minute. I do want to let people know that Jason will be posting that survey link in the chat any minute now. Please do take it. It'll also be sent out to you via email. And while we're waiting to see, Olivia, if there are any more questions,
Mhm.
I was thinking about that community responsibility piece that you brought up. And I think
Mhm.
that's an excellent idea to not only expand what we know, but to really start to shift the narrative around this. When you kind of propose the idea of community responsibility, what might that look like?
That's a great question, and something I wish I had more time to get into in this presentation. Um, Community responsibility looks like anything from the small acts, and when I say small, I mean talking to your friend. How do you talk to your friends, right? I literally, before, when I was prepping this presentation, I was sitting at a coffee shop, and next to me, these two men were talking about a woman who was stalking this one guy, and I listened to how they talked about it, and they were laughing and minimizing this experience. But this woman had looked up his information online, found out where he went to get coffee, and would show up there repeatedly. And they were kind of laughing about it. And there are a lot of layers to that particular example, particularly around men and men's safety and the perceived risk uh, that they might be facing versus a woman and that kind of thing. But it was just interesting. So I think on the kind of in the smaller interactions that you have, it's about calling out that minimization. If your friend thinks that this person that lives in their building, for example, is really cute and takes pictures of him taking his garbage out, and you're getting these pictures repeatedly, hey, maybe say, like, that's a little odd. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that. It's those little examples. But I think on the bigger scale of things, as far as community, it's also advocacy. Advocacy was self-advocacy is exhausting. These women would have full-time jobs, and some of them worked multiple part-time jobs. One woman in particular, she was in theater, community theater, and she would do public performances. And so all of her posters had been defamed, and she would go on stage fearing that he would be there in the audience. And you can just imagine the amount of energy that was going into her preparing for that possibility of something like that happening, preparing for that outside of having any sort of informal support. uh, some people would just quit their jobs if they could, or would move, or would you see stalking related suicides and things like that occur. So community response is really take down those posters. See if your friend is okay, check in with them, know about what resources are available in your community, and don't be afraid to have those conversations. This is something that is still considered taboo. I think a little bit less so now than it used to be, but like I said, this has all happened very recently. I still consider the 80s and 90s to be recent for people that are
As
like,
do I, as do
yeah,
I.
it's recent. And so there are a lot of different examples, but I think this comes down to that creativity of response, and public education as well. A lot of this research talks about, what does that public education look like? What's going to stand out? In intimate partner violence literature, we talk about including men in the conversation. That's also key. What does stalking look like for men and for gender diverse people? So yeah, it's kind of whatever is within your means, your capacity, your ability to do that. But I think speaking out about it, talking about it is huge. And I think that even if you think no one's going to listen, it might strike a chord with at least one person, and that's all that really matters. Yeah,
Absolutely. And those are some really practical examples. I appreciate that.
I
Because
try.
sometimes when you ask people like what that looks like, the examples are like, well, research this and do that versus like, here are these really concrete things that you as a person can do. That was
Yeah, find training on it. I talk to your parents about it. Like sometimes there are generational boundaries as well, or barriers rather. I there are so many ways, it's you aren't as limited as you might think you are. I think it's about being creative and bringing these things up and seeing what responses you get. Worst thing that can happen is someone says no to your idea, right? You just go somewhere else. And working together too, there were some examples too where somebody said that their coworkers would report to her when her ex was outside the building and would walk her around the building to her car and stuff like that. And these seem like little things, but she literally had a little army of 5 women that were looking out for her when she went to work, and that enabled her to come to work, do her job, and feel safe, right? And that's just one example. There are so many examples. I wish that we had more time to talk about it, but that's the one that comes to mind.
now that I think that's the definition of a caring community. That's great.
Hmm.
The question has come in from Andrew, who says, thank you, Olivia, for your presentation. Research in the US context often shows that stalking victims may face barriers or perceived barriers to reporting to police. Do you think similar barriers exist in the Canadian context? Do we have different barriers? And did this show up in any significant way in your research?
Oh, I love this question. Thanks, Dr. Nevin, another wonderful researcher. Yes, we often see, I mean, this is even outside of intimate partner violence work, comparisons between Canada and the United States. Geographically, we are quite close. Culturally, in some ways, we are similar, whether we'd like to believe that or not, depending on what you're talking about. And I think in intimate partner stalking, I mean, much of the literature comes from the United States. They are a lot more advanced in the work that they've done. There's a lot more of a concerted effort. And part of that is because they benefit from having things localized to a state by state model rather than a federal model like we have. So their state by state model allows them to compare and contrast responses of police and barriers in a way that we can't necessarily do, and certainly can't do as easily as comparing province to province. So there's research in that way that just means that we, in some ways are largely behind in the work that we need to be doing. As far as barriers, the barriers are quite similar. Barriers are around stigma, access to police, certainly in rural and more remote areas. The other barriers can include things like, when they do, whether or not they do report to police has to do with the norms in their community, has to do with the normalization component. Is what I'm experiencing actually stalking, or is it not? That determination in itself can be a barrier. So yes, they are quite similar. As far as different barriers or anything that's unique, I can't think of anything off the top of my head beyond that we don't really have the response, or we don't have the centralized resource of Spark. So one of those barriers in even determining should I contact police or what's going to happen if I contact police is that people just don't have those answers beyond searching something up on the internet and hoping that it's going to give them something relevant. So when they do that, Spark will tell them, this is what's going to happen, or this is what's available in your jurisdiction. We need that here. And that's something that is currently being developed. I believe, I'm going to butcher this. I believe it's the Canadian Anti-Stalking Association that Julie Lalonde is starting, or has started as of 2020, January of 2024, but it's still in its infancy and needs a lot of support and a lot of resources to get off the ground and get funding, get working to a point where we can have something like Spark. So I think having information is critical, and having that understanding of what's actually going to happen. Am I going to be believed, or is it going to be like a coin toss? So.
All right. And then one more question's come in from Ryan, who says, excellent presentation, Olivia. You raised policy. If you had an audience with a key policymaker, for example, the Attorney General, what would you suggest they do? What are your 1 or 2 key recommendations for action?
Oh man. Okay. I love this question. One would be to remove fear, standards of fear completely, remove fear from the definition of stalking. It shouldn't be anywhere in the definition that women have to, or men, anyone, should have to have as demonstrated impact in an emotional response kind of a way. And then related to that, it would be that criminal law instead focuses on the inability to live your life normally. That's something that women are, and I say I'm using gender terminology because this is a gendered crime, but anyone who's experiencing stalking can demonstrate through various forms of documentation that they are not able to live their life normally, and what those impacts are. So it removes that subjectivity that we see in police response and in other formal responses and informal responses, but it removes that subjectivity from that component, and instead focuses on how they're going about their life. Are you able to work? Are you able to drive? Like, so many of these women, again, because they were of somewhat higher socioeconomic status, were able to borrow someone's vehicle or change out a license plate. And then they said, oh, I felt free. Someone said, I didn't feel free until my car broke. Like, my car broke down. I ended up getting a new car. And suddenly it was like, I could go anywhere, because he had no idea what, it, like, that kind of impact is huge. But inability to go to the same grocery store that they would go to. And usually it was around inability to work, things around parenting, and routine. So I would say that's one of my key recommendations for action.
That's well said, and I agree that the idea that something subjective like an assessment of fear would ever be included is, I don't know, it kind of dissuades people from reporting. It also hinders what we understand to be like legal process if assessment of fear can be one of the criteria.
Yeah, I mean, as far as, another potential response to that question, though I'm not a police scholar, would be more so around police response and having some sort of better understanding of the standards of police practice. So at times, subjectivity of police response can be phenomenal, but I think having mandatory specialized training would be absolutely key. There is research, it's more so international research, a lot of it based in the UK, the EU, around specialist officers having a better understanding of stalking as a whole. Certainly they're specialized in it, but as part of that, better outcomes for victims, better responses. They were, when given vignettes, were better able to determine what was actually happening, and how they could better respond, what their options were, when victim services was appropriate, and better able to use their subjectivity in their response. When we don't have that specialized training, use of subjectivity then becomes quite dangerous, because that's when we rely on our understandings of general human behavior. And when I would suspect that police would determine that this person should be experiencing fear in order for something to transpire. So again, specialized training or a mandatory specialized training would be great. If I had all the funds in the world, that would be fully funded. And same with social support services as well, and just an ability to increase their capacity for responding to these things. We don't have a lot of programming specific to stalking.
Now that is the dream in anti-violence, to just have unlimited funds to do
Yeah, if I
whatever you
became
want.
a billionaire, no one would know, but there would be signs, and that's one of them.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
thanks.
actually a fabulous way to wrap this up. So thank you, Liv, on behalf of both myself and Ava, and I'm sure all of the participants. This is absolutely fantastic, and I always love learning about your research. So truly, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
And just a quick reminder for those who are in attendance, there is that survey link in the chat, and we hope to see you at future webinars.